All right, guys, so today I'm going to show you how to make floating shelves out of 2x4s. These shelves are super easy to make, super inexpensive, and they hook right onto the wall, and you're not even able to see where they're screwed in. So I'm going to show you guys how to do all of this so that you can create your own custom shelves for your workspace. Okay, so in order to do this project, we're obviously going to need some supplies. We have basically a wood saw. I recommend you actually do your measuring first and get Home Depot to cut your wood for you, but if you can't, you can get a saw guide like this that helps you cut both 90 and 45 degree angles, as well as a pretty inexpensive hand saw at the hardware store. We're also going to use 2.5-inch drywall screws, and these are coarse thread sharp point. You want them to be very, very pointy in order to be able to drill through the wood into the drywall. And we're going to be drilling these shelves into the studs on our wall, which I'll show you in just a second. You are going to need a jig. This is called a jig, and also the drill bit that goes with the jig. I'm going to put the link to this particular one down below the video so you can check out exactly which one this is. But this is a Craig jig. And the cool thing about jigs is you're able to drill diagonal holes into the wood, and I'll show you guys that as we get going with putting the shelves together. You're also obviously going to need a drill. You're going to need a Sharpie, a pencil, some type of marker to be able to mark on the wall and also be able to mark your wood if you're going to be cutting. And you will need a tape measure. You will also need a stud finder, or I'll also show you how to do it without a stud finder just by using sound. And of course, you're also going to need a 2x4 or however many 2x4s that you want. Okay, so to get started, we're going to measure in between the studs on our wall, and we're also going to measure how long we want the shelf to be. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to figure out how long of a shelf we want to make. So this 2x4 is almost exactly 4 feet long. And so you could make 4-foot shelves, you could make 2-foot shelves, however long you want your shelves to be, you're going to measure your wood to that length. The next thing what we're going to do is we need to also put that exact measurement on the wall, and we need to center that same 48 inches onto the wall where we're going to hang the shelf. I'm just going to show you guys on a wall in my garage because I'm actually going to install these shelves somewhere else, but I wanted to at least show you for the tutorial how this is going to work. Okay, so we're going to take our same 48-inch measurement, and we're going to basically try and line it up on the wall to see about where that would fit. So from the end of the tape measure all the way to the 48-inch mark, you want to put that on your wall so that you're going to be able to see whereabouts the shelf is going to sit once it's installed. Then once you take a look at this, the other thing you need to factor in is where your studs are. Typically, studs are behind your sheetrock. They basically are the same thing as a 2x4. The 2x4s are what are behind your wall, and behind the sheetrock there are these 2x4s, usually with nails or screws that are put in to be able to hold the sheetrock to the 2x4. So one easy way to be able to find where those studs are or where those 2x4s are is to use a really strong magnet stud finder. What this does is it finds either the nails or the screws that were used to drill the drywall onto those 2x4s or 2x6s, depending on what was used in construction, and it'll easily tell you exactly where the stud is. So what you can do is put it up against the wall. It'll obviously float around and it'll drop if you let go of it until you find a stud. So what the magnet just found is it found, and this is easier to see because I've got taped drywall, usually you've got wall texture over it and you're not going to be able to see. So what you're going to do is just float your stud finder over the wall until it sticks. This one's a magnet, so it just found the screw or the nail that is holding my drywall to the 2x4. Typically studs are 16 inches apart. So typically if you find one 16 inches over, you're going to find another one, but it depends on how the house was constructed, when it was constructed, what the code was at that time, etc. But typically that's a good rule of thumb. So we want to make sure, especially if we're putting up a big shelf, we want to make sure we have at least 2 studs to hook our screws into. So I'm going to keep sliding this over. Sometimes you need to go up and down because the screws may not be in the same position. So you can see if I back up, I have one stud over there and I have one stud here where my tape is. But again, you're not gonna have tape on your wall because you're gonna have wall texture over top of your drywall and you're gonna have paint too, okay? So let's check this measurement real quick to make sure that I was right about the whole 16 inches thing. So they actually put these studs in our garage a little bit further apart. They're about 24.5 inches apart from the center of the stud, okay? So double check, make sure, like I said, 16 inches is usually a general guideline, but make sure that you're understanding where your studs are. So our shelf is 48 inches long. So we need to make sure that this 24.5 inch space between the two studs where we are gonna drill our holes is somewhere centered on this shelf so that we can disperse the weight. So let's put this back up here again. Okay, so what you can do if you want to is you can kind of guesstimate where the middle of your shelf is. So for this shelf, it's gonna be 24. We're just gonna mark that real quick. Okay, then we know that the two holes that we're gonna drill are 24.5 inches apart because the screws are usually in the middle of the stud. So we wanna make sure that we do from the center of the stud to the center of the stud over there. Okay, so what we can do is we can take that 24.5, divide it by 2, which is gonna be 12.25. And what we're gonna do is we're gonna put the 12.25 mark right in that center mark where we marked on our 2x4. So can you guys see that? That's where we marked the center of the board. And we're gonna put the center of our holes right on that center mark as well. Now what I'm gonna do is mark the 2x4 right at the end of my tape measure. That's gonna be my first hole I'm gonna drill. And then right at the 24.5 inch mark, I'm gonna put the other one. Okay, cool. So now we have 3 marks on our board. We have our first hole that we're gonna use to drill this shelf into the wall. We have the center of our board, which is very helpful for also making sure it's centered where we want it to be. And then we also have our third mark right here that is gonna be our second hole where we're gonna do our drilling. Okay, so in order to create floating shelves, we obviously need to put invisible holes in order to be able to screw this board to this wall where the stud is, okay? So we're gonna use this Craig jig. What it does is we're gonna put the Craig jig onto the board and it's gonna guide our drill bit at a diagonal angle so that we can actually drill a hole that's gonna go kind of starting from the top. The hole's gonna go through the board and it's gonna go out the other side of the back. So you're not gonna see any screws going through the front of the board, okay? So that's the whole idea behind using these Craig jigs. This is the drill bit here, and like I said, I'll put a link to this exact same size and everything because this worked the best for what we were doing, especially with these 2x4s. You need a drill bit that obviously is going to go all the way down and through the other side of the board. And you also need to make a hole big enough that you're going to be able to screw in the screws that we're going to use to adhere this board to the wall. Okay, so when you put your jig on your board, you actually want to put the jig a little bit further back from the side that you want the hole to come out of, because this is going to create a hole starting about here and then it's going to go down through the board and out the other side. The other thing you're going to want to do is use a C-clamp. This is a metal C-clamp that you can use to hold the jig in place while you're drilling because this thing likes to wiggle around quite a bit. So make sure that you secure this in place so you don't end up making a giant hole. All right, then once you drill your hole, you're gonna take off the C-clamp and the jig, and you should have a nice gradual pathway for your screw. Okay, cool, so this is exactly what you want it to look like. You're gonna have this nice gradual hole inside of the board, and this is gonna be where we put our screws when we hook the board onto the wall. So you're gonna do one hole on each on each mark that you made, and then I'll show you guys how we're gonna level this and put this on the wall. Okay, so as you recall, we wanted to line up the center of our stud, which is wherever the magnet usually hits, is pretty dang close to the center of the stud behind the wall. So you're gonna wanna line your hole up with the stud. Okay, perfect. So once you have the hole that you drilled centered with the stud that you found on the wall, then you're going to screw the board into the wall. And to do that, we're also gonna check to make sure that the board is level. So for those of you who have never used a level before, levels actually have bubbles, and as long as the bubble is equally in between the two lines on your level, then you know that the board is actually completely straight on the actual wall. So just make sure that you either go up or down, depending on what you need to do on either side. And if it's really crooked, I'll show you just a second, okay? So this is really, really crooked, even though it's lined up with the stud, you'll see that the bubble floats all the way to the side. If we bring the board down just ever so slightly, in a little bit of time, you want to do that until the bubble is perfectly centered between those two black lines. So once you have that and you've got that lined up with the stud that you found, you're going to actually use those screws to screw the board to the wall. Okay, so the other thing we want to consider is the height of the board. So studs usually run all the way from the floor to the ceiling. So as long as you keep your holes lined up with the stud, you can go as far up the wall or as far down the wall as you want. So just decide wherever you want your first board to be. And then once you have one board on the wall, then you can measure the next board as far as the height, and you'll know exactly where those studs are. You're just going to continue the whole process. Okay, so then you're just gonna take your drill bit and those drywall screws, put the screw down into the hole, and then you're just gonna drill right into the sheetrock and the stud behind it. Now, it should be pretty difficult to actually screw into this spot on the wall because there is a wood stud behind it. So if your screws go in without any effort whatsoever, it means that you're not actually screwing into the stud behind the wall, you're screwing into the drywall. Now, I promised you guys I would show you how to figure out if you're on a stud even if you don't have a stud finder. One of the ways you can do this is actually using sound. So I'm going to click on the wall for a second and you guys will be able to hear the difference. Okay, so if you notice when I'm clicking on when I'm wrapping my knuckle on the actual place on the wall where the stud is, the sound gets very dense sounding and it clicks more. When it gets over on just sheetrock with insulation behind it, it has more of an echoey, empty sound. So like I said, if you're screwing into the wall and the screw goes right into the wall, it means you're just screwing through sheetrock, and that's not on a stud, so it's not going to be secure. But once you have this secured on both ends of the board, this is going to be a rock solid shelf for you. Show you guys what it looks like on my wall. Now you can get as fancy as you want to with these shelves. You could sand them, you could stain them, you could paint them, you can do whatever you want. You can also do the screws on the bottom, or you could do it on the top, so this whole thing could flip over and that way you won't see any screws on the top. The reason why I like to do the screws on the top is because it's much easier to drill them into the wall. If you're doing from underneath, sometimes it's a lot more difficult to do. You could also fill in these holes with some spackle or some caulking, and then you can make this smooth and make this whole entire screw disappear. I just needed these shelves for my own personal studio space, so I'm able to just put my gel polishes right over the top of that and line them all up on the board. So I didn't care enough to actually do all of that extra kind of tweaking at the end. But if you're doing this in your salon and you want things to be splinter free and get rid of all of the unsightly holes and hide the screws, just put a little bit of caulking or something, paintable caulking, in this hole, smooth it out with your finger, and then you can also paint over that spot so that everything is nice and smooth and invisible. And like I said, you can sand these, you can get super fancy with them. You'll notice that I didn't paint them at all. They still have the 2x4 stamps on them. The only thing I did do is I made sure that there weren't any big knots on the top that were going to impact the flatness of the shelf. So just keep that in mind when you put these up. So there you have the simple 2x4, really cheap shelf idea that you guys can do in your own spaces, whether you're in your salon or you're at home.